Welcome back, dear Seekers. Welcome to another episode of Seekers of Grace. Today's conversation is truly something special. I'm joined by Ric Weinman, founder and current lineage holder of the most magical lineage in the world, VortexHealing Divine Energy Healing, whose work has touched countless lives worldwide. Known for the clarity, presence, freedom, and transformation it brings, VortexHealing has impacted people across the globe. This is a conversation you don't want to miss. Welcome to the show, Ric.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you. VortexHealing is described not only as a healing modality, but also as a path of awakening guided by divine intelligence. What's fascinating is that even simply receiving a vortex healing session can work very deeply and stir deep changes in how the sense of self operates. Today, words like awakening and ego are everywhere in modern culture and have become part of everyday language, even outside spiritual circles. Given how common and confusing this word has become, and that you literally map down the evolution of ego and creation, let's start at the beginning, from the ego. My question is, what is ego exactly?
Ego is a little cartoon character that, sorry. So the ego is basically this sort of bubble of self-referential consciousness that has its own sense of agency. And so it's like an inner identity that says me or I, that's separate, and it keeps reflecting that sense of itself back to itself, which maintains the sense of like an ongoing sort of permanent, unchanging sense of self. Even though other stuff changes, people will often say, I'm the same as I was when I was a child, just my body's different and this and that. But the sense of self becomes this organic, self-referential sense of agency. That's on the human level. On a deeper level, there are all these different. There's this whole development of the ego from the highest dimensional level down through the dimensions that where this sort of initial sense of I almost as a possibility becomes densified into a sense of I that can take on an incarnational path and develop into eventually a human ego. Describing that whole development would be much too complex for here. But the sense of I, just to point out, the sense of I is different from the sense of me, which if your listeners drop in and they just say I, and they follow the sense of that, it's going to be different than if they say me, which is more of a it has more of that kind of self-reflection in it, and that sense of me will change over time. Like if a person is sick, their sense of me is not going to feel well, where their sense of I that's feeling that me is still going to be the same. Which, of course, takes us into the question about what does awakening mean?
Exactly, that's my next question. So on to the term of awakening, which often means very different things to different people.
Yes.
So my question is, what is true legitimate awakening? One, and how do you personally know and check if someone is truly awakened and has got through at least basic awakening?
Yeah, I hit them on the head and see how they react. So within this description that we've mapped out of how the ego develops. For us, the core sense of that is more developed to that sense of I. The sense of me is more, how that I experiences itself in human form. But the deeper egoic sense is not so much the emotional sense, but ego is separate from the emotional sense. Our ego invests itself in all this emotion, but it's actually this sense of I as separate from you. And on the human level, actually on the incarnational level, there's this development of what I've learned to call the core veil, which sits in the heart. And it's this energy consciousness structure that keeps reflecting the sense of I back to itself. And that's how it maintains itself. So, in traditional spiritual literature, they talk about making the mind still as a vehicle for awakening, and that works, but that's very, very hard to do. And for basic awakening, it's this place in the heart that needs to become still, which is much easier than trying to make the mind still. Because that core veil is just reflecting the sense of I, and the moment that reflection stops reflecting, that basically that becomes still, something happens. Now, a person needs to be ripe for that to happen. It can't just, happen, to anyone. If there's not enough spiritual development, you can't make the heart still enough. And so we define basic awakening as what happens when that stillness enables that reflection to stop, and then the core veil breaks down. The mirror in that heart breaks. And what's fascinating is that everything changes and everything remains the same. Should we go into that?
I remember you opened the core veil class like that. It was the first thing you said.
Yeah.
So please, let's go into that, because there are a lot of misconceptions about awakening and what it means in practical. So please, if you're up for it.
Excuse me. So basic awakening doesn't change the conditioning. Your mind is still your mind, your emotions are still your emotions. But the I that was invested in all that, something in that sense of I has disappeared. And so your relationship to all of that thinking and emotion and drama has fundamentally changed, which changes everything. And yet all that conditioning is still the same. Tying back to an earlier question you had was, how do I tell? So before awakening, everything in the mind keeps reflecting back to that spot in the heart. It keeps self-referencing itself through the core veil. It's thinking, I'm hungry. That I goes to the heart. It goes to the heart, specifically to the core veil in the heart, not to like the sense of love in the heart. It goes to this sense of I in the heart. And when the core veil breaks down, that whole echo between the heart and the head disappears. So it just becomes this I in the head, and it's no longer sitting in the heart. That heart becomes a no I zone. Literally, there's no I there. And the mind can get very confused. And it's part of the way everything changes. So the I, there's still this I in the head that's thinking all of its stuff, except that it can feel that something has changed in the heart, but it can't understand it because it's a no I zone. It can't go there. So then if the mind gets quiet enough for a moment, that awareness drops out of the head into the heart, it turns into this experience of beingness, and then one pops back up and then goes, what was that? What was that? And because it just can't understand, the I cannot understand what it's like to not be I, right? And so the whole fundamental experience of life goes through this fundamental change, even though the thinking is still the same and the other conditioning, the emotional conditioning is still the same. Now, so for me, it was kind of like it was a bit schizoid like that, because I had this I in the head, and then I had this place of just, beingness. And about a year later, I saw Adi Shanti, and I told him about my experience and said, this has been going on for a year. And he looked at me and smiled and said, only a year? So this is something that can go on for some time. And what shifted is eventually the mind gave up trying to understand, what was going on in the heart. It just gave it up, went about its business as if, as if nothing had changed. And meanwhile, I had this still dual experience, but, there wasn't the struggle around it anymore.
It's interesting because I was listening to a rabbi teaching, and he said that most of Jewish spiritual masters agree that the biggest distance in the universe is between the head and the heart. So that made me think about awakening and the ego. And just sort of like a deepening to that. I know you already answered a little bit this question, but for anybody out there, if they are questioning themselves, have I awakened? Did I have a legitimate awakening? What would be your advice?
Oh, that's a hard one because that's very subjective. I mean, they could try to sense it. The eye in the head references the heart. So another thing that happened is that when this moved through for me, and I realized suddenly this core sense of I was gone, and trying to understand it, I accessed a memory from the day before where I knew my sense of I was there, right? And from the outside, well, from a distance, you go, okay, I have this memory and the sense of I is there. But if I would then zoom into that sense of I, it would just disappear. It was like I needed a sense of I in the present to be able to access, not just see from a distance, but to access a sense of I in my memories. So people can do that, but it's really easy to fool oneself.
I remember in class, it was Corvale. He said, if you're asking yourself if you have awakened, the answer is always going to be no. In fact, I did ask myself, I was like, oh, and then, we got through class and I've tried, and it was sort of like, it was like an empty question in a way.
Yeah. So it's, just to clarify that, it's not so much that the answer will always be no, but the place in consciousness that's asking the question is not the place that's awake if awakening has happened. So then, because of the confusion between the I and the head and the heart, the I in the head will say, well, am I awake? And that will always be no, because the I in the head is never awake. It's just the I in the head.
Okay.
But just a couple of other things along this line. So, in terms of, what's awakening, because we have all these kind of fantasies about what that's going to be like, from, omniscience, to, all power, to, perfect peace. And some of these things might be available at the very end of the road when one, hits the the totality of what awakening can be for human consciousness. When you get in someone like Ramana Maharshi. But that's, very few humans are ever going to get into that place. Um, um, so for me too, I had all these expectations of what was going to happen with awakening, which is why I was another thing that fed the confusion when awakening happened. And I called a psychic friend of mine and said, is this awakening? So I asked the question too. And she said, see if it persists. And it did. And that sense of I never came back. And now, that doesn't mean that the ego is gone. So just to be very clear, awakening doesn't kill the ego, because the ego is still operating through the mind in this self-referential consciousness, right? Um, and but one's relationship to the ego has changed. Like the ego is part of the functionality of the consciousness, and in fact, vortex healing, we have a term functional ego, and so that ego is still there, and that functional ego, will include all this kind of emotional stuff and mental stuff. The question is, what are you identifying with, right? And so the moment that, let's say, your free spirit, or your awareness identifies with this some anger that's arising, then it loses its freedom and becomes lost in that self-referential self-identity of being angry, right? The moment that you break that identity, and anger is arising, but it's not you, right?
Yes, so like after awakening, before awakening is like we sort of run away from pain and bad emotions. And it's like after awakening, it's more like embracing it, and you almost run towards it.
Yeah.
So you can make more space.
Yes. And to just an example that comes to mind that shows how idiotic it really is to identify with what's going on in the body, is, imagine someone has a big fart. If they're identified with everything that's happening in that bubble, they're going to experience themselves as a fart.
So, on to my next question. Your book, Awakening Through the Veils, paints a picture of healing and awakening as an intense and often difficult process. With other students that have also taken all your awakening classes, we were talking about it, and we said that there is no warning on the box, and that the cover should be painted in blood, or there should be a disclaimer on it at the very least. My question will be, why should anyone be bothered and interested in the awakening? And what is the whole point? What does it really bring into someone's life? I know you already mentioned about you don't become identified with your issues, and your relationships with your issue changes. So maybe, why should anyone be bothered or interested in awakening?
Well, first of all, I do have a little warning thing there when I talk about, how it's confusing and all this other kind of stuff. Um, and that it can dramatically change one's life. What's interesting to watch is what happens with people when they wake up in terms of their partner relationships. And so, like, we observe three different things that can happen. One is their partner doesn't notice it at all. The second is that, because one of the things that the awakening does is it makes a person more present. It's not that the ego is more present, but there's more presence present, which many of those students' partners will find lovely. It's like, oh, you're juicier. There's more of you here. I can feel you more. But there's the third category. And the third category is that because it helps to break the identification with the drama, the person isn't as engaged in the drama as they were before. There's more space there. There's more detachment. Not the fake detachment of the wall, but there's more real detachment there. And sometimes the partners will feel as if they're the awake student has like abandoned them, or is no longer with them. Instead of noticing how much more available they are, they're focused on that the person isn't as entangled with them, on an attachment level. And so then they react negatively to that. So, so why would someone want to awaken? Well, why does a moth want to go towards the flame? It's sort of like innate response. And for humans, it's sort of an innate response to suffering. They're suffering, and and awakening is really the only way out. Now, of course, one of the fantasies of around awakening is that all my suffering will suddenly end. No. Again, your relationship to your suffering changes. But, it also creates a space in which you can more easily start to transform the things that are creating the suffering, right? Because there isn't the same locked in, glued in identity, you now have a space in which you can start to work with that stuff, which creates more freedom from suffering. But the true freedom from the suffering has to do with losing the identity with it. And so, although the ego wants to get free of suffering, in the end, there's more and more freedom from suffering. But it's not that the ego has gotten freedom from suffering. There's less and less ego, and so there's less and less of someone who's suffering.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And
I
what?
Sorry. I would add, though, too. Sorry. That for people who have some psychic sensing ability, usually awakening will help that as well, because again, there's more space and there's more attunement to what's deeper. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And what does healing really mean? And how would someone recognize that healing is happening? Or why are we even healing?
Well, I mean, the main reason for healing is that people have stuff they want to change. That is, again, causing them suffering in some way or another. And so, the way it's recognized is that things are experienced as being better. Maybe the person isn't as angry, or doesn't get as angry as often, or isn't as sad, doesn't react as much, when their kid goes, why do that? Maybe has a little more compassion for the kid instead of getting angry. Now, one can judge it from how one feels like immediately after a session, because sometimes a session will stir things up, and it can take a day for things to just settle down, or it might be immediate as well. Or most of the time, especially when there's body stuff going on, relief, some kind of relief, if the healing is successful. Not all healings are successful. There are, so for instance, Vortex Healing has done amazing things with a whole range of things, but we haven't had much success with tinnitus. And recently I don't have a private practice, but I worked with someone that had tinnitus to see, how, I could, work with that. whether I could have any effect. And one thing I noticed was that this person in one ear, it almost looked like an echo chamber. And he said, "Oh, that's interesting. I've been trying to find words for that." And it's very disturbing and sort of disorienting because, he would hear things that would sort of echo. I was able to clear the echo chamber. And then in a follow-up session, I felt almost like the pitch of the tinnitus came down, became a lower pitch. And he relayed back that he couldn't say exactly what shifted, but it was less disturbing now. But I wasn't able to clear the tinnitus. I'm still not sure why, but it's just a very tenacious condition. So at the same time, like I ran into a woman on the Omega Institute campus, who shared she was bipolar, and I could see why she was bipolar. And in a few minutes, I had shifted it, and the bipolar is gone.
Wow.
So, we're going to have tremendous results with all kinds of conditions. And then there are going to be conditions. I mean, you take some kind of chronic disease condition, some of those you're going to improve somewhat, some of them you're going to improve a lot, some of them you're going to cure completely, and some of them you're not going to have much effect on because the thing has just gone too deep.
Mm-hmm. And as for emotional consciousness, obviously, like everything is conditioning. Like, say, you're feeling anger because you grew up and your dad was a very angry person. But like, can it be deeper than that? That emotional consciousness comes from sort of somewhere else, like acquired from past lives and things like that.
Yep. So the conditioning. Three sources of conditioning. One is, all the ancestral, which includes parents. So, well, first of all, we have this genetic conditioning. Then we have all of our conditioning from all of our memories from past lives. And then we have our present life stuff, which is all the identification with our parents and, things that happen to us. Although for the most part, the things that happen to us trigger reactions that are already sitting there as potentials, from all this other conditioning we have in this, marvelous bubble of self-referential consciousness.
Thank you. I will open the next question with a couple of quotes from your classes. I have the best collections of your quotes, by the way. I remember them all because they really changed my life. So the first quote is, every choice is a divine choice. And the other one is, only freedom is truly free. This really helped me to surrender more to life, or getting triggered if the choice didn't really align with my agenda, depends how you look at it. But my question will be in regards to free will. What is free will? Do we have free will? Did God give us free will?
So, as you said in the quote, only that which is free can have free will by definition. So what's free? Well, is the ego free? No, it's just a bundle of self-referential conditioning. So the ego cannot have free will. Now, the ego experiences itself as having free will because it experiences choices arising and being made. But again, where are those choices coming from? So choice arises, choice happens, but ego isn't really making those choices. Now, the ego has this whole pattern of different kinds of conditioning that tends to move things in a certain direction. But we've all had, and so what free will typically does is let that play out. So it seems as if that conditioned choice is making the choice. But that's not a choice. That's just reflex, you know. Um, um, so we've all had experiences where our tendency would be to choose one thing, but for some reason that we don't know, we chose something else. Those little windows give us, insight into, the nature of free will, that it's sitting there in the background, either allowing things to play out or moving things in a little bit of a different direction. Another way I put that sometimes is that it's fine to say that you have free will as long as you recognize that it has a mind of its own. And what really clued me into this was years ago, I was going, after years of being out of college and working, odd job, all this stuff, I decided to go back to college and get a master's degree in computer science. And I was taking all these courses, too many courses, trying to cram enough in to get into a master's program, like, in a semester, to get qualified. And I was in complete overload. And at some point, it was just too much. And I was standing by this armchair and I just gave up. Like my whole will to finish this program just collapsed. And I collapsed into the chair. And between the moment where I started to collapse into the chair and the moment when my butt hit the chair, this little twinkling happened over my head, came into my body. And by the time my butt hit the chair, my mind had been changed. It went from total collapse to, to excitement about the program, to this deep intention to finish the program, everything changed. And I actually got into a master's program with a teaching assistantship back in my spiritual home of Tucson, Arizona. At that point, I was at my parents' house in New York, and then at some point, in the same way that they kept me in, they meaning the divine free will, because of whatever my path was, and also to bring me back to Arizona, which was my spiritual home. At some point where enough of that had been played out, there was this other little, call it divine intervention, that got me out of the program into full-time healing. But that first one, I mean, that was an eye-opener. It was like, I thought I had decided that I was done and something else decided I wasn't. And not only changed my mind about it, but changed the way I felt about it, changed everything about it. And it's like, who's in charge here? It's not me. And then I realized that whatever that twinkle was that shifted that inside, that's actually present in the background in every moment of our lives. Right? And sometimes it's just letting the conditioning play out. Like if it would have let the conditioning play out, it would have just let me, drop out of the program. But instead, it took me on a different path. And, and we don't notice it. It could be something as small as, a rainy day, you're in a restaurant and then the rain stops and you leave and you forget your umbrella because it's not raining anymore. You go 3 blocks down, or maybe the next day you come back for your umbrella. And because you've had to come back, you end up meeting someone there on the way back. Your whole path of life has changed just because now you're going back to that restaurant. Maybe that makes you miss a car accident you would have been in if you were going somewhere else that day instead of going back for your umbrella. And you don't even ever notice it.
Wow.
But it's just all this little subtle stuff from the background. Now, at the same time, that way of looking at things can make it look like everything is predestined. And I don't see it that way. I just see it as divine free will is unfolding in the present. And in the present, certain things become defined in the future, and other things are yet to be determined. It's it's like if you're writing a book, you might have certain things in mind that are going to happen, but what happens in between and all these other things that are happening in the book, you figure out as you're going along. And um, um, and even things that seem to be determined now for the future, divinity has the freedom to change that at any point because it's free will.
Thank you. That was fantastic. My next question will be, death is something that scares many people, but also fascinates them. Hopefully you're not tired of being asked this question. Every class I took with you, someone asked this to you. So here is once and for all. What happens when we die? Like, we take our last breath. What is going to be our experience? And is that going to be the same for everyone? Does it change once people have awakened and completed their incarnational journey?
So there's this story of this couple that die and they go to heaven, and the angels greet them and say, "Let's give you a tour." And so giving him a tour, and it says, this is these are your living quarters, and and it's a gorgeous place with with everything you could want. And here's the the recreation area with swimming pools and um, uh, yoga classes and all this kind of stuff. And then it takes them to like the cafeteria, and there's there's all this wonderful food and desserts like unimaginable. And the man says, well, I can't eat that, my cholesterol. The angel says, you're in heaven, you can eat whatever you want here, it doesn't matter. And the man turns to his wife and says, you and your damn bran cakes, I could have been here 10 years earlier. But seriously, so after we died, it's it, it's almost like we go into this self-referential bubble and process. It's like when you go to sleep at night, you process your day, right? At the end of a life, you process your life. So you go into some place in consciousness. There is this experience of a light door that can happen, and you go through that light door, and there's this moment of of sort of remembering and release and peace. But you also have, as this bubble of self-referential consciousness, you need to process what's happened in that life. And so in the early part of that, for someone who's psychic, who can kind of reach through consciousness, you're more accessible. But after a while, you drop. And in that period, someone who's also a healer who can do that, that can facilitate, can help to release things that weren't released in that life, and can help to heal issues and such. But as the person goes deeper into, kind of that processing, that becomes inaccessible. But at some point, just like when you finish processing at night, you're ready to wake back up the next morning. At some point, when you're finished processing your life, you're ready for another adventure. I was at a retreat where two different people asked Amma this question, and she gave two different answers according to where these people were. In the one, she gave the bigger picture answer, which is, what happens to the electricity when the light bulb goes out, which points to that, that it's all one. It was always one, and just the form is changing, right? And that there really wasn't anyone who lived, wasn't anyone who died. It's just part of the play. And the other person, she said, you go to some place in consciousness according to your level of development. And if there's still desire there, which means there's still hooks, right? The desire brings you back.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Fantastic. So it's going to be a blast, basically. I love it.
Right. And just to add, for people that awaken to a certain level, they might not be done, but the need to come back physically is gone, and they become 8th, 9th, or 10th dimensional beings. I call it the no more diapers awakening. We do in the core veil class. It's like the incarnational body has this dense outer layer that sort of helps to kind of create a certain density to that incarnational package that's needed to sort of ship it into a physical body. And we break down that boundary so that the person doesn't need to come back anymore.
Wonderful. Since the show it's called Seekers of Grace, what actually is grace and why do we need it?
What is grace? Well, one way of looking at grace is that it's divine love. It's the way, let's say you've done something bad to a friend and you go to them and ask for forgiveness, and the person truly and honestly opens their heart and forgives you. The feeling of having been forgiven is this same feeling of feeling grace. It's like something that's given to you beyond anything that you deserved or could insist upon, or it's really different than your friend goes, oh yeah, okay, I forgive. But the friend goes, yeah, I know you didn't really mean it. I love you, and all that pain that's been sitting there from what you did just releases. It's like a blessing. Like
Mm-hmm.
Grace is like a blessing, and grace is there actually all the time, because that blessing is what gives us the ability to experience life in the way that we're experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
Every breath we take is grace, but we don't always notice it.
Thank you.
We take it for granted. It's just it's like a fish not noticing that it's wet, but grace is the fabric of the universe, basically.
Thank you. The next question is a bit of a big one, so any insights on that will be appreciated for the time that we have left. So many of us spend our lives asking the big questions like, why are we here and what's the meaning of life? My question will be, how was life created and what is the whole point of our existence?
What's the what point?
What's the point of life and of our existence?
So, first of all, we got to come back to the big picture, which is, when someone asks, what is the point of my existence? The question is, who is that my or me that's asking the question, right? So you can't really answer the question without knowing who's asking the question. And the thing is, there is no real who that's asking the question. There's a particular way that divinity has expressed itself into creation that has become this form of a person that's experiencing itself as separate, which is this absolutely miraculous event. That's something that is completely non-separate, that can never be separate from anything else because it is everything that is, can enable itself to have this experience of being a separate someone. What a miracle. Pure magic, right? And so in terms of meaning, meaning is something that is something that the mind wants as a concept. I want to know what my life means. So the ego is looking for an egoic answer, right? It's looking for a concept that it can put as a label on its life, but so, for instance, if a person is feeling in love, that whole question disappears, right?
That's so true.
Right. There's no, they're not looking for anything outside to give their life meaning. They're experiencing the meaningfulness through the experience of love. And so it's only a valid question when we're not, it's only even a question when we're not actually experiencing what life is about. Right. So
divinity is just having an experience in the end of the day, pretty much.
Yeah, it's having this experience of not understanding itself. And in that moment of love, it knows what it is, which is love. And so the question just disappears.
Thank you. What do you think is the most important question a person can ask themselves?
Would be, who or what am I?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And if divinity could give us a message right now, what will it tell us?
Oh no, everyone's going to ask that question for themselves.
See.
But if you're asking about, what message I could give, you have to give me a moment. Okay. So what arises has to do with surrender. It's you have to find some place that's deeper than what you normally experience that you can trust, listen to, and follow the guidance of. Because that will help you to get out of your reflex. Just conditioning arises and plays out. Conditioning arises and plays out. For myself, whenever there is a choice to be made, instead of just reflex or going by the gut, or which is also conditioning playing out. I drop inside, I connect with divinity, and I ask, should I do this or should I do that? Now I may want to do this, and I get to do that, and I just do that. I trust my connection to that place, and I just keep following it. Now, someone may say, well, I'm not able to listen very well to that place inside. So here's the ironic kind of kicker. If you make all the right decisions, quote, right, from an egoic point of view, you won't get as far down the path as you will making all the wrong decisions from a surrendered place.
Wow. Enlightening. Thank you so much. What an incredible conversation. It is always a rare privilege to sit in the presence of your level of understanding and wisdom. Thank you truly very much for joining us today. And for all of you, dear seekers, if you want to go deeper into Ric's work, Mr. Weinman has also shared his teaching through his books, which I highly recommend you to read. And if you want to take it even further, I would always encourage anyone to take Vortex Healing classes yourself. And I mean, anyone, you don't need to be spiritual. You don't need to know anything. In fact, we have people from all walks of life. We have teachers, nurses, psychologists, engineers, body workers, and even scientists who are taking Vortex Healing classes. You can visit vortexhealing.org. That is vortexhealing.org, where you'll find all the information you need to sign up to your foundational training and all the information about Vortex Healing. And if you get advanced enough on your level of training, you'll get the opportunity to become Ric's student yourself, as he's only teaching the most advanced trainings and the awakening classes.
And I teach with Lorraine one in-person foundational class at the Omega Institute in August.
Oh, yes, that's very true. It's the only foundational class actually that is being taught in presence, like in real life. You can take all the pretty much all the classes online, which is really, really great. We managed to get to this point. So yeah, check it out. Until next time, remember, the truth of what you are is that you are love and compassion. Be good, be well, and don't forget your magic. Ciao for now.